Entire islands in Indonesia are disappearing. Not from rising seas, not from erosion. They are being blown apart, loaded onto ships, and turned into someone else's country. That country is Singapore. And the wildest part is that this has been happening for decades, completely legal, and most of the world had no idea until the islands started vanishing faster than anyone could map them. Singapore has no mountains, no quarries, no room to grow. The entire country sits on an island smaller than New York City. By the 1960s, the government faced a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The population was exploding, industries needed space, ports had to expand, and there was simply no land left. Building taller helped with housing, but you cannot stack airports or container terminals. So Singapore made a decision that sounds insane, but worked. If there is no land, make it. Buy mountains in other countries, blow them up, ship the pieces back, and dump them into the ocean until new ground appears. Since 1960, Singapore has added more than 140 square kilometers of new territory. That is roughly 25% larger than the original island. All of it built by importing sand, gravel, and crushed rock from neighboring countries. To understand the scale, imagine flattening an entire mountain, loading it onto thousands of ships, sailing it across open water, and pouring it into the sea until you create enough land to build a city. Then do that again and again for 60 years. The process is called land reclamation, and Singapore turned it into a national strategy. In the beginning, it was simple. Malaysia and Indonesia had rivers and hills full of sand. Singapore had money. Contractors would dredge riverbeds or quarry hillsides, load the material onto barges, and sail a few hours to Singapore. The sand would be dumped into shallow coastal water, layer by layer, until it rose above sea level. Then engineers would compact it, build seawalls to hold it in place, and declare it usable land. Early projects were small, a few hectares for a new port, a widened road along the coast, space for a factory. But as Singapore's economy grew, so did the hunger for land. Changi Airport is one of the clearest examples. It opened in 1981 on reclaimed land along the eastern shoreline. Every expansion since then, every new terminal, every extended runway, sits on ground that used to be underwater. Jurong Island is even more extreme. It is a fully artificial island, created by merging 7 smaller islands and filling in the gaps with imported material. Today, it hosts Singapore's entire petrochemical industry. Oil refineries, chemical plants, storage tanks, all sitting on millions of tons of sand and rock shipped in from abroad. Without land reclamation, none of that infrastructure would exist. For years, the system worked smoothly. It was cheaper to import sand than to engineer alternatives. Malaysia and Indonesia earned money from exports. Singapore got the land it needed, but the environmental cost was invisible until it became impossible to ignore. In Malaysia, rivers were dredged so aggressively that entire banks collapsed. Villages downstream lost farmland to erosion. In Indonesia, the damage was worse. Small islands near the Riau archipelago began disappearing entirely. These were not mountains hidden in jungles. These were inhabited islands with fishing communities, homes, and boats. Contractors would arrive, strip mine the island for sand, load it onto ships, and leave. Within months, the island would be half its original size. Within a few years, it would be gone, swallowed by the sea. Fishermen in Riau went to work one morning and came back to find their island visibly smaller than it had been the day before. The sand mining was so intense that coastlines changed faster than maps could be updated. Local governments complained, but the money kept flowing, and the sand kept moving. It was not until satellite images started showing the scale of destruction that the issue became international news. Environmental groups called it one of the most devastating but least visible forms of resource extraction in the world. Indonesia was not just selling sand, it was selling its own territory. In 2007, Indonesia banned all sand exports to Singapore. Malaysia had already reduced shipments years earlier. Cambodia followed in 2009, after discovering that dredging in the Mekong River was destabilizing banks and threatening water flow into Vietnam. Suddenly, Singapore's supply of cheap sand was cut off. Construction projects slowed. Prices spiked. The government faced a strategic crisis. How do you keep building when your neighbors refuse to sell and you have no domestic supply? Singapore adapted fast. Diplomats negotiated new deals with Myanmar and the Philippines, though the distances were longer and costs higher. Engineers researched alternatives. Instead of dredging riverbeds for sand, contractors began crushing rock into gravel. It was more expensive and required more processing, but it worked. Singapore also began recycling construction waste. Demolished buildings were crushed into aggregate and mixed with imported material to stretch supplies. Policies were introduced to reduce waste and increase efficiency. Projects were redesigned to use less fill by relying on deeper foundations and elevated platforms instead of building up from the seabed. These changes slowed the rate of reclamation, but did not stop it. Between 2000 and 2020, Singapore still added roughly 10 square kilometers of new land, despite the export bans. But the political cost became harder to ignore. For Malaysia and Indonesia, every ton of sand sold to Singapore felt like losing their own country piece by piece. Small islands that vanished became symbols of national pride and anger. There were accusations of illegal smuggling, reports that Singapore contractors were bribing officials to bypass export bans, and diplomatic tensions that strained relationships for years. One of the most controversial projects is Tuas Terminal, Singapore's newest and largest container port. It is being built on reclaimed land along the western coast and will eventually cover 400 hectares. Construction required tens of millions of tons of fill material imported over more than a decade. Much of it came from Myanmar, a country with fewer environmental regulations and less political pressure to stop exports. Critics argue that Singapore simply shifted the environmental damage to a country that could not afford to say no. Supporters counter that Singapore pays fair prices, follows international law, and that stopping growth is not an option for a nation with limited space and a growing economy. The engineering behind land reclamation is more complex than it looks. You cannot just dump sand into the ocean and expect it to stay in place. Ocean currents erode coastlines. Storms create waves that can wash away loose fill. The material itself settles and compacts over time, sometimes unevenly, which can cause buildings to tilt or crack. To prevent this, engineers begin by surveying the seabed in detail. They map depth, currents, and the stability of the ocean floor. Then, they design a reclamation plan tailored to that specific site. The first step is usually to build a containment barrier. This can be a rock bund, essentially a wall of large stones placed along the perimeter of the reclamation area to block currents and hold the fill in place. In deeper water, engineers use geotextile tubes, massive fabric cylinders filled with sand that act as temporary walls. Once the barrier is set, barges begin dumping sand or crushed rock inside. GPS systems guide each barge to precise locations, so the fill is distributed evenly. As the material piles up, it is compacted using heavy rollers or left to settle naturally under its own weight. Once the fill rises above sea level, engineers check for stability. If the ground is too soft or settling unevenly, additional layers of material are added, or the soil is reinforced with deep pilings. Seawalls are constructed from concrete or steel sheet piles, driven into the seabed to protect the new land from wave action. Drainage systems are installed to manage rainwater because reclaimed land has no natural aquifers or soil layers to absorb water. Everything must be engineered from scratch. Reclaimed land is not the same as natural land. It has different hydrology, different load-bearing capacity, and different risks. Plants grow differently because there is no organic topsoil. Flooding risks are higher because the elevation is often only a few meters above sea level. Heat retention can be worse because there is no groundwater to moderate temperature. Singapore has learned these lessons through trial and error. Early reclaimed areas had drainage problems and required expensive fixes. Newer projects incorporate better design from the start, but every square kilometer of new land is an artificial system that requires constant management. There is also the issue of permanence. Rising sea levels and more frequent storms mean that reclaimed land built today may be vulnerable in 50 or 100 years. Singapore invests heavily in coastal defenses, seawalls, and flood management systems, but these are ongoing costs. Reclaimed land is not a one-time project. It is a long-term commitment to maintaining infrastructure that nature is constantly trying to reclaim. The human cost is harder to measure, but real. Families in Indonesia and Malaysia who lived near rivers or on small islands watched their land erode or disappear entirely. Some were compensated, Many were not. The sand trade created jobs and income for contractors and exporters, but the environmental damage often fell on people who had no say in the decision and received none of the profit. For them, Singapore's growth came at their expense. For Singapore, the calculation was different. The alternative to reclamation was stagnation. No new ports meant losing competitiveness to Malaysia or Thailand. No new industrial land meant turning away investors. No new residential areas meant housing shortages and rising costs. The government framed land reclamation as a matter of survival. A small city-state with no natural resources except its location had to maximize every advantage. If that meant buying mountains from other countries and turning them into islands, so be it. There is also a strategic dimension that is rarely discussed publicly. Expanding Singapore's physical size has military and geopolitical value. A larger coastline provides more options for naval facilities and port infrastructure. More land means critical systems can be dispersed and harder to target. During the Cold War, and even now, Singapore's location at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula makes it one of the most important shipping choke points in the world. By expanding its territory, Singapore ensures it remains the dominant logistics hub in Southeast Asia. Malaysia cannot easily compete because alternative shipping routes are longer and less developed. That advantage is built on reclaimed land. Most Singaporeans live their entire lives on reclaimed ground without realizing it. The airport, the industrial parks, the eastern and southern residential districts, Marina Bay with its luxury hotels and financial towers. Almost all of it sits on imported sand and rock. Children play soccer on fields that were underwater 30 years ago. Tourists visit Marina Bay sands without knowing they are standing on what used to be open sea. In a way, it is a testament to how normal the process has become. In another way, it shows how invisible the cost is to the people who benefit. Looking forward, Singapore has ambitious plans to reclaim even more land. Proposals include expanding the southern coastline for future industrial and residential development. But the question of where the material will come from is unresolved. Importing sand is now expensive and politically sensitive. Crushing rock is costly. Recycling construction waste helps, but cannot supply enough material on its own. Some engineers propose floating platforms or underwater structures that do not require fill. Others argue that Singapore should accept limits and focus on density and vertical construction instead of endless expansion. But after 60 years of growth built on reclaimed land, stopping is not easy. The entire model of Singapore's development depends on the ability to create space when there is none. That model is now facing resistance from neighbors, rising costs, environmental pressure, and the reality that you cannot keep buying mountains forever. Singapore proves something remarkable. You can buy land if you have enough money and determination. You can flatten mountains in one country and use them to build cities in another. You can turn ocean into ground and ground into one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. But the strategy has limits. The neighbors are running out of mountains to sell. The environmental cost is becoming impossible to ignore, and the ocean does not forget. Every ton of sand dumped into the water shifts currents, changes coastlines, and affects ecosystems in ways that will not be fully understood for decades. Singapore built itself by consuming the geography of others. It worked because the world allowed it to work. The question now is not whether it was impressive, it was. The question is how long it can continue, and what happens when the sand runs out.